A mother stood in the snow with 7 children clinging to her coat, while an entire town decided which one of them would survive. The crowd wasn't offering help. They were dividing up her family like furniture at an estate sale. This child to the millers, that one to the blacksmith, the baby to whoever would take her. Elena Harrow had buried a husband, crossed 3 states on a broken wagon, and eaten bark soup to keep her children alive. And now strangers were going to finish what the frontier started. Like, comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. And follow so you don't miss what happens next. The town of Red Hollow had never been much to look at, even in its better years. A single main street of weathered storefronts, a livery stable with a caved-in corner, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse whenever the circuit judge bothered to show up. In summer, dust coated everything. In winter, the cold came down off the mountains like something with a personal grudge, and the wind found every crack and every wall and worked at them patiently until the walls gave up. This particular November, the cold had arrived 3 weeks early and brought company. 2 feet of snow sat on the rooftops. The creek that fed the town's well had frozen solid for the first time anyone under 60 could remember. Half the livestock had already died. The remaining families were burning furniture to stay warm, and the general store's shelves held more empty space than goods. Red Hollow was dying, and everyone in it knew it. The town meeting had been called for 7 in the evening at Alderman Pruitt's feed store, which was the largest indoor space available now that the church had lost its roof to a November ice storm. By 6:30, every adult in Red Hollow had crowded inside. 41 people in a building meant for maybe 20, breathing each other's air, smelling of wood smoke and wet wool, and the particular sourness of people who hadn't bathed since the cold set in. Children were not invited. This was not a meeting for children. Elena Harrow stood at the back near the door because there was nowhere else to stand. She had arrived in Red Hollow 6 weeks ago with a wagon that had lost a wheel somewhere in the foothills, 7 children ranging in age from 14 months to 11 years, and $11.40 in a tobacco tin she kept tucked inside her dress. Her husband, William, had been dead since August. A fever that took him in 4 days, the kind of death that gave you no time to prepare and no particular explanation. He'd been healthy in July. He was in the ground by the end of summer, and Elena had been left with the children, the wagon, the tin of money, and the realization that the homestead they'd been headed for was another 200 miles west, and she had no possible way to reach it alone. Red Hollow had been the nearest town. She'd pulled the wagon in on 3 wheels and a prayer, and the town had tolerated her presence the way a dog tolerates a burr, with visible discomfort and occasional attempts to shake it loose. She'd done what she could. She'd taken in mending. She'd helped Mae Dunbar with her laundry twice a week for meals. Her oldest, Thomas, 11 years old and already built like a small man, had shoveled snow and hauled water and split wood for anyone who'd pay him in food or coin. But winter had tightened its grip before Elena could build anything solid beneath them, and now they were living in the tack room behind the livery stable, sleeping 6 to a pile under every blanket she owned, and the baby, Clara, 14 months old with William's dark eyes, had been coughing for a week. Alderman Pruitt called the meeting to order by banging a hammer on his workbench. He was a thick, florid man in his 50s, the kind of person who'd grown comfortable enough in his own authority that he'd stopped questioning it. He looked at the assembled faces and cleared his throat. "We all know why we're here," he said. "Resources are thin. The Harrow woman and her children are consuming what this community cannot spare. I want to be plain about that because there's no kind way to say it, and I'm done trying to find one." Elena kept her face still. She'd been expecting this. She'd been expecting it for 2 weeks, honestly, ever since she'd overheard Pruitt talking to the blacksmith outside the feed store. She'd had time to brace herself. It hadn't helped. "I've spoken with several families," Pruitt continued, "who are willing to take in the older children as working members of their households. The Callaway Ranch needs a boy old enough to work. The Millers have offered to take 2 of the girls for domestic help. That accounts for 5. For the younger ones, including the infant, you can stop." Elena's voice came out quieter than she intended, but it carried. The room shifted. "You can stop right there." Pruitt looked at her the way a man looks at something that's wandered into a conversation it wasn't invited to. "Mrs. Harrow, this meeting is for residents of Red Hollow." "I'm standing in Red Hollow. That's close enough. She moved away from the door, working through the crowd. People made room for her, not out of courtesy, but because something in how she was moving, deliberate, not angry, just absolutely unwilling, made them step aside without quite meaning to. She got to the front of the room and turned to face them all. She was 32 years old, and she looked older than that right now. Her coat was mended in 4 places. Her hair was pinned up, but not carefully. There hadn't been time for careful in a long while. She wasn't beautiful in the way that made people write poems. She was the kind of woman who looked like she'd been tested repeatedly and was still standing, which was its own thing entirely. "I understand the situation," she said. "I'm not stupid, and I'm not asking for charity. But I won't let you separate my children. I won't do it." May Dunbar, who'd been kind enough to Elena over the weeks, spoke up from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. "Honey, the Millers are good people. The children would eat—" "I know the Millers are good people. That's not what this is about." Elena turned slightly to address the whole room. "If you scatter them across 7 different families, they lose each other. My 11-year-old loses his sisters. My baby loses the only people she's ever known. You're asking me to save their bodies by breaking everything else they have." "Better a broken family than a dead one," Pruitt said flatly. "Easy thing to say when it's not your family." The silence that followed was the uncomfortable kind. A few people looked at the floor. Pruitt didn't. He never looked at the floor. "I've made my decision," he said. We'll proceed. I'll take them." The voice came from the back of the room, deep, unhurried, roughened by years of cold air and minimal conversation. The kind of voice that didn't raise itself because it had never needed to. The crowd turned. Elena turned with them. The man standing in the doorway was enormous in the way that occasionally happened in mountain country. Not fat, not theatrical, just built on a larger scale than most people, with shoulders that nearly filled the doorframe and hands that looked like they'd been made for heavier work than human hands usually were. He had a beard that had been growing without much supervision since sometime the previous winter, and a scar that ran from his left eyebrow down across the bridge of his nose that had clearly not been treated by a proper doctor when it was fresh. His coat was elk-hide, badly cured. His boots were wrapped in cloth at the toes. He looked like something that lived in the mountains, because he did. "Garrick Hale," someone near Elena muttered, not to her, just into the air, the way you say a name when you're not sure it's real. Pruitt's floored face shifted through several expressions before settling on something like cautious disbelief. "Mr. Hale, I didn't know you were in town." "I'm in town twice a year," Garrick said. "You don't usually notice." He wasn't looking at Pruitt. He was looking at Elena, with the direct, undecorated gaze of someone who'd spent so much time alone that he'd lost the habit of looking away to be polite. "You're the widow with the 7. "I am," Elena said. "My cabin's 3 hours up the South Trail. It's small, but it's solid. I've got enough stores laid in for a hard winter, and I know how to get more." He said it the way someone states a fact about weather, without emphasis, without feeling the need to sell it. "They can come with me. All of them." The room erupted. Not loudly. These were cold, tired people. Not a theatrical crowd. But the eruption was real, in the form of overlapping objections and sideways conversations, and the specific quality of noise a group makes when they think someone has lost their mind. "Hale, that cabin can't hold 9 people. The trail's death in winter." "You don't know anything about children." Garrick waited out the noise the same way he probably waited out storms, without particular impatience, without arguing back. When it died down enough, he said, "I wasn't asking for opinions." "You can't be serious," Pruitt said. "I said I'll take them. That's what serious looks like." Elena studied him. She was good at reading people. She'd had to become good at it, the kind of skill you develop when you can't afford to be wrong about who you trust. She looked at Garrick Hale and tried to find what was underneath the offer. Men didn't do things like this without reasons, and the reasons weren't always the kind a woman with 7 children could afford to be near. What she found, or what she thought she found, which wasn't the same thing, was not warmth. There was nothing warm about him. But there was something that felt like honesty in the bones. The kind of person who didn't have enough patience for dishonesty, who would rather say a hard thing plainly than a comfortable thing falsely. She didn't know if that was enough. She didn't know if she had a better option. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. The room had gone quiet enough to hear the wind working at the feed store's siding. "Because they're going to die down here," he said, "and I've got room." It wasn't a romantic answer. It wasn't even a particularly kind one. But it was the most honest thing anyone in that room had said all evening, and Elena felt something in her chest shift toward it almost against her will. "The trail," she said, "in this weather, with a baby. It's cold. It's not impossible. I wouldn't offer if it was impossible." He paused. "I've done it alone and worse." Pruitt had recovered himself. "Now hold on. We don't know what this man intends." "He intends to feed my children," Elena said, "which is more than this meeting has managed." She looked at Garrick again, made herself say the next thing plainly because she needed to know. "I want to be clear. I am their mother. I decide what happens to them, not you." Something shifted in Garrick's expression, not softened exactly, but adjusted, like he'd recalibrated something. "Understood," he said. "And if it doesn't work, you can leave in spring when the pass opens. I'll bring you back down myself." She should have asked more questions. She knew that. She should have talked to May Dunbar privately, asked around about this man, given herself a night to think it over. But Clara was coughing in the tack room, and Thomas had stopped complaining about his hunger 2 days ago, which meant it had gone beyond complaining, and the winter wasn't going to hold while she deliberated. "All right," she said. Pruitt started talking again. Elena stopped listening to him. They left at first light the next morning, before Red Hollow was fully awake, which felt right. The town had nothing good to offer them in farewell, and Elena had no desire to stand around accepting cold comfort from people who'd been planning to divide her children like furniture 12 hours earlier. Thomas carried the pack with the mending supplies. Her second oldest, 9-year-old Ruth, carried the food they had, which wasn't much: half a sack of cornmeal, some dried beans, a handful of salt pork that was going questionable at the edges. The middle children, Daniel, 7, and the twins Sophie and May, both 5, carried what they could manage, and were warned twice that complaining was not going to be an option today. 4-year-old James walked on his own because he had strong opinions about being carried that Elena didn't have the energy to argue with. 2-year-old Nora rode on Thomas's back. Elena carried Clara against her chest, the baby wrapped in both their coats, her small, feverish face pressed into Elena's neck. Garrick said nothing to any of them. He simply started up the trail. The trail was not a trail in any comfortable sense of the word. It was a suggestion, a general direction pointing upward through the pines, visible mostly because someone had traveled it before, and the trees grew slightly farther apart in that line. The snow was knee-deep in the open stretches, and Garrick broke through it ahead of them without apparent effort, packing it down enough for the children to follow in his wake. The cold was a physical thing, not uncomfortable cold, dangerous cold, the kind that found your wrists where your sleeves pulled back and tested whether you were paying attention. Elena watched the children's faces and counted their breaths and kept moving. James made it 40 minutes before he stopped walking. He didn't cry. He just stopped, with the particular stubbornness of a 4-year-old who has reached his limit and has no language for it except stillness. Elena looked at Garrick's broad back, 10 feet ahead. "Mr. Hale." He stopped and turned. "James needs to be carried." He looked at James. James looked back at him with exhausted, wary eyes. The eyes of a child who'd learned not to expect much from large adults. The silence between them lasted about 4 seconds. Garrick walked back, crouched down to James's level, and waited. He didn't reach for the boy. He just waited. James studied him. Then, with the gravity of a small person making a large decision, he raised his arms. Garrick picked him up and settled him on his shoulders without comment and kept walking. James gripped the top of his head and didn't say anything either. Elena filed that away. It didn't make her trust him, but it was something. They reached the cabin 3.5 hours later. The extra 30 minutes attributable to the pace of children and a baby who needed feeding twice along the way. Elena smelled it before she saw it: wood smoke, pine pitch, something animal curing somewhere nearby. Then the trees thinned, and there it was. Small was accurate. It was a single-room structure built from heavy timber, low-roofed and solid-looking, chinked with what appeared to be a mixture of clay and moss. A woodpile ran the length of the east wall, stacked to the eave. There was a lean-to off the back that smelled like livestock, and through a gap in the boards, Elena could see the flank of a mule and what appeared to be 2 goats. She stood in the clearing with her children clustered around her and looked at it. Then she looked at Garrick. "It's 1 room," she said. "Yes. 9 people. I can count." She turned back to the cabin. The children were looking at it the way children look at things they're trying to decide about, not with the adult ability to weigh pros and cons, but with some older, simpler instinct that just reads safe or not safe, shelter or not shelter. Sophie, the more serious of the twins, reached out and took Elena's hand without looking up at her. Elena squeezed it. "Well," she said to no one in particular, "it's warmer than the tack room," and she walked toward the door. Inside was a single stone hearth that threw real heat, a sleeping platform along the back wall, a small table, 3 stools, shelves holding clay pots and dried herbs, and a row of glass jars with things preserved inside them that Elena couldn't immediately identify. Elk hides on the walls, a rifle above the door, firelight touching all of it in amber and shadow. It was nothing like home. It was nothing like anything she'd had before. It smelled like a stranger and felt like a stranger, and outside the single small window the mountain rose above them into low gray cloud. But it was warm. Clara, pressed against Elena's chest, had stopped coughing. Or maybe Elena just couldn't hear it over the fire. Either way, she held her daughter a little tighter and looked at the flames and told herself she hadn't made a terrible mistake, and mostly, in that moment, she believed it. Garrett came in last, ducked under the door frame, and set James down near the fire. The boy immediately pressed his palms against the warmth, eyes half closed. The others crowded in behind him, and the small cabin filled with the sounds of children thawing. Small sighs, shuffling boots, the twins whispering to each other in the half-language they'd invented somewhere around age 3. Garrick looked at them all for a moment, then looked at Elena. "There are rules," he said. "I expected there would be," she said. "We can go through them in the morning, tonight." He moved to the shelves, pulled down a pot, set it on the hook above the fire. "Tonight we eat." Elena watched him move around the small space with the efficiency of someone who'd arranged it to fit his body and his habits, who'd never had to account for another person in it, let alone ate. He moved without elegance and without waste, and the soup he put together from dried stores and a strip of smoked meat. He pulled from somewhere in the back was not good. She could tell that before it was even finished. But it was hot, and there was enough of it. And when she watched her children eat it with the hollow, earnest concentration of kids who hadn't had enough for too long, she had to look away. Thomas caught her looking at nothing and came and stood beside her, and she put her arm around him without thinking about it, and he let her without thinking about it either, which was the particular grace of an 11-year-old who was still close enough to childhood to allow it. Garrick ate last, standing near the door, watching them all. He didn't say anything. Elena had the feeling he wasn't sure what to say, and that this uncertainty was not something that happened to him very often. Outside, the wind was picking up again. The mountain pressed down on all of them, enormous and indifferent, the kind of presence that made the entire concept of human plans feel very small. But the fire held. The soup was hot. And Elena Harrow, widow, mother of 7, newly arrived at the edge of the world, sat with her children around a stranger's hearth, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that tonight they might actually be all right, just tonight. She wasn't promising herself more than that. Tonight was enough. The rules came the next morning, delivered over a breakfast of boiled oats that Garrick portioned out with the precision of someone who'd already calculated exactly how long his stores needed to last. He stood at the head of the table, which wasn't really a head, the table only had 2 ends, but he stood at the end farthest from the fire, and that established something. And he looked at the children arranged on the floor, and the 2 stools, and the sleeping platform's edge, and he said, "I'll say this once." Elena stood against the wall with Clara on her hip, watching. Wood doesn't collect itself, water doesn't carry itself, heat costs work, and work costs food, and food is what's keeping all of us alive until the pass opens. He wasn't raising his voice. He never raised his voice. Elena was already learning. He simply said things at a volume that made you understand he expected them to be heard the first time. The oldest boy works with me. The older girls help your mother. The little ones stay near the fire and don't touch anything on those shelves unless you're told to. Thomas, who was 11 and had opinions about being referred to as the oldest boy, said, "My name is Thomas." The room went quiet in the way rooms do when a child says something to a large, scarred stranger that could go badly. Garrick looked at him. "Thomas," he said without inflection, "you work with me." Thomas nodded once, trying to look like this had been his idea. "What about the goats?" Ruth asked. She was 9 and practical in a way that sometimes startled Elena. The kind of child who skipped past the emotional weather of a situation and went straight to logistics. "Do they need tending?" "Every morning. I'll show you." Garrick picked up his coat from the peg by the door. "Any questions?" Sophie raised her hand. She was 5 years old and had apparently decided, overnight, that this was school. Garrick looked at the raised hand for a moment, like it was a thing he hadn't encountered before. "What?" "Where do we sleep?" It was, in fact, a reasonable question. The sleeping platform along the back wall was wide enough for 4 adults lying close, maybe 5 if nobody had strong feelings about personal space. Last night they'd managed by stacking the younger children together in the middle, and Elena sleeping on the outside with Clara, while Thomas had taken the floor near the fire, and Garrick had apparently not slept at all, or if he had, he'd done it sitting in the chair near the door, because that's where Elena found him when she woke at 3 in the morning to feed Clara. "We'll figure it out," Elena said, before Garrick had to. He gave her a look that might have been gratitude, though it was hard to tell with his face. The first week was the hardest because everything had to be negotiated from nothing. Not just the sleeping arrangements, but the entire architecture of how 9 people shared 60 square feet without losing their minds. Garrick had built the cabin for one person and had arranged it accordingly. Every shelf, every hook, every established habit of where things went and when, all of it was built around the assumption of solitude. Elena watched him absorb the disruption of her family the way a tree absorbs a windstorm, by not moving, mostly, and just enduring the noise until it passed. The noise was considerable. The twins fought with the specific intensity of 2 people who know each other too well for mercy. Daniel, 7 years old and in possession of an imagination that was either going to make him extraordinary or get him killed, kept picking up Garrick's tools and attempting to do things with them. James cried every evening at the same time, a residual habit from when they'd been in Red Hollow, and evening meant uncertainty about whether there'd be dinner, and the habit hadn't yet caught up with the reality that there was dinner now, thin as it was. On the 3rd day, Daniel knocked a jar of dried sage off the shelf, and it shattered on the stone floor. Garrick turned from the fire, looked at the broken jar, looked at Daniel, who had gone the color of chalk. Then he crouched down and picked up the pieces without saying a word, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. Daniel stood frozen, waiting for something that didn't come. When Garrick stood up and deposited the shards outside, Daniel let out a breath that had been held since the jar left the shelf. "He didn't yell," Daniel told Thomas later, with the tone of someone reporting a minor miracle. "He doesn't yell," Thomas said, with the authority of someone who'd now spent 3 days working alongside the man. "He just looks at you." "Is that better or worse?" Thomas thought about it. "Depends on what you did." Elena heard this conversation from the other side of the room and stored it away with everything else she was collecting about Garrick Hale. The way he moved through his own space, the sounds the cabin made at night when he got up to put wood on the fire, the fact that he kept a small knife in his left boot that he never mentioned and probably didn't know she'd noticed. She wasn't cataloging him out of suspicion exactly, though that was part of it. She was doing it because she'd spent 9 years married to a man she'd thought she understood completely, and he'd died in 4 days from a fever and left her with nothing she'd been prepared for, and she'd promised herself she would never again stop paying attention. By the end of the first week, she'd established several things. Garrick Hale was not a patient man. Patience implied a kind of emotional generosity he didn't seem to have, a willingness to wait while feeling something about the waiting. He wasn't like that. He was something quieter than patient, Simply consistent, unmovable in the way of a rock formation, rather than a person who'd chosen to hold still. He gave instructions once and expected them to be followed, not because he needed compliance, but because he determined what worked and saw no reason to do it differently. When things went wrong, he fixed them without commentary. He was also, Elena noticed, very carefully sleeping in the chair by the door every night, so that the children could have the platform. She brought it up on the 8th night, after the children were asleep, and she was nursing Clara by the fire, and Garrick was doing something with a length of leather cord that she thought might be a repair to one of the snowshoes hanging on the wall. "You should take part of the platform," she said. "The children can compress. They do it anyway." "I'm fine." "You're not sleeping." He glanced up from the leatherwork. "I sleep." "Not much." She kept her voice down, not wanting to wake anyone. "I'm up with Clara twice a night. I can hear you." A pause. He went back to the leather. "I sleep light." "That's not what I said." She waited. He didn't respond. "Garrick." He looked up again. It was the first time she'd used his name directly, and they both seemed to notice it at the same moment. "You've been in that chair for 8 nights, she said. "You're doing hard physical work every day in extreme cold. You need to actually sleep." He was quiet for a moment. "Your children don't know me." It took her a second to understand what he meant, that he was staying by the door so they wouldn't wake at night with a large, strange man on the sleeping platform 3 feet away and be frightened. The practical, unspoken consideration of it caught her off guard in a way she hadn't expected. "I'll tell them," she said, "in the morning." He didn't say anything, but the next night he took the end of the platform, with Thomas between him and the rest, and Elena lay awake listening to the storm outside, and the breathing of her children, and thought about the fact that she'd been so certain, that first morning in Red Hollow, that she was walking into another kind of trap. She still wasn't certain she wasn't, but it was getting harder to find the evidence. The rules, she had to admit, were not unreasonable. They were the rules of the mountain, not of Garrick's particular personality. The mountain had its own logic, rigid as stone, and Garrick had simply learned it the hard way and was now passing on what he knew. Wood had to be split before the storm hit, not after. Water had to be fetched from the spring in the morning before the temperature dropped, because by afternoon the path iced over and someone would fall. Wet clothes went on the line near the fire immediately, not later, because in this cold, damp was dangerous in a way that it simply wasn't at lower elevation. Thomas learned this faster than Elena expected. There was something about the mountain, or about Garrick's way of teaching, which wasn't teaching exactly, more like doing things in front of you and waiting for you to figure out why, that reached her son in a way that a classroom never had. By the second week, Thomas was getting up before Garrick to put wood on the fire. He didn't announce this or seek approval for it. He just did it, and Garrick looked at the fire when he woke and then looked at Thomas and gave one short nod, and Thomas turned away quickly to hide that this had mattered to him. But the mountain didn't care about any of it, about families learning each other, or children growing, or small moments of understanding between a boy and a man who didn't know how to talk to each other yet. The mountain was deepening its winter, and what had seemed like a manageable cold in the first week became something structural by the third. Not weather anymore, but a condition, the baseline state of the world, as if warmth had only ever been a temporary loan, and now the debt was being called in. The second major storm hit on a Tuesday. Though the day of the week stopped mattering pretty quickly up there, the days being distinguished only by what tasks they contained and whether the storm was worse or better than the day before. This one lasted 4 days. 4 days in which they couldn't open the door without losing heat they couldn't spare, in which the woodpile shrank faster than Garrick's calculations had planned for, in which the children went stir-crazy in the particular way of children who are cold and bored and hungry in a space not much bigger than a generous pantry. Sophie and May's relationship, which was intense under the best circumstances, deteriorated into open warfare by day 2. They fought over blankets, over floor space, over which one of them had breathed on the other side of the sleeping platform. Daniel attempted to build something out of firewood that he described as a fort, and that Elena described as a fire hazard, and that Garrick dismantled without comment, returning each piece to the woodpile with a precision that was its own kind of reprimand. James cried. Nora, 2 years old and usually the most adaptable of them, picked up a clay pot and threw it at nobody in particular, which was startling and also, in its own way, expressed what the rest of them were feeling. Elena was managing the children, which meant managing the temperature of the room in every sense, keeping Daniel from driving everyone insane, keeping the twins from actually hurting each other, keeping herself from saying things she'd have to apologize for later. She was doing this on interrupted sleep and reduced food, and in a single room that contained 8 other people and no privacy and no window big enough to see anything other than white. By the third evening, she and Garrick were in direct conflict for the first time. It started over the food portions. Garrick had been running the calculations. He did it every evening, a private arithmetic of what they had versus what they needed versus how many days until they could possibly resupply. And he'd come to her quietly while the children were occupied and said they needed to reduce the evening meal. By how much? She said. 1/3. She stared at him. They're already hungry. I know. They're children. They need... I know what they need, he said. And there was an edge in it she hadn't heard before. Not anger, but something pressed hard against patience. I also know what we have. And what we have won't last another 3 weeks at the rate we're going through it. Then we find more. There is no more right now. There is a blizzard outside that a person cannot survive in for more than 20 minutes. So we just... She stopped herself because Clara was looking at her with the bright, unblinking attention of a baby who hadn't yet learned to filter out adult emotional weather. She lowered her voice. So we just let them go hungry. We let them be hungry tonight so they're alive to be hungry tomorrow. His voice had come down too, matching hers. That's the choice. She turned away from him and stood looking at the fire and thought about how much she hated that he was right. She was very good at arguing when the other person was wrong. She was not good at this. How much do we tell them? She asked, finally. Nothing? Not yet? Smaller portions, same manner, no explanation. Children read panic faster than they read facts. She'd thought the same thing, more or less, in different circumstances. It galled her, a little, to agree with him twice in a row. The reduced portions happened, and the children noticed, because children always notice, but they didn't ask, or the older ones didn't. James looked at his bowl for a long moment and then looked at Elena with an expression of 4-year-old dignity that meant he understood more than he should have to understand, and she looked back at him and made herself keep her face steady, and he picked up his spoon and ate what he had. That night, after everyone was asleep, Elena sat by the fire with her knees pulled to her chest and let herself feel all the things she'd been keeping behind her face all day. Not crying. She was too tired for crying and too stubborn, just feeling them, which was its own kind of work. She heard Garrick shift on the platform, and then the creak of him sitting up, and then his footsteps. Quiet for such a large man, she'd noticed that. He walked carefully in the cabin, aware of sleeping children, and he sat down in the chair near the fire. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. After a while, he said, "The storm will break by morning." "You can tell that?" "Usually." A pause. "There's a sound the wind makes when it's finishing, high and steady. I've been hearing it for the last hour." She listened. She couldn't distinguish what he was describing from the general howl, but she believed him. He'd been hearing this mountain for years, and she'd been hearing it for 3 weeks. She didn't have the right to argue about it. "Garrick," she said, not asking anything, just saying it. He looked at her. "I'm going to need to know more," she said. "About the stores, about the actual numbers. I can't manage them if I'm working without information." He was quiet for a moment. She thought he was going to push back. This was his domain, his cabin, his years of accumulated knowledge. But instead he said, "Tomorrow I'll show you." "Thank you." The fire cracked and settled. Outside, she thought, maybe, the wind was changing its pitch. "My wife liked storms," Garrick said. Elena went very still. In 3 weeks, he'd said nothing personal, nothing about his life before the cabin, before the solitude, before the elk-hide coat and the scar and the twice-yearly trips to a town that barely remembered his name. She'd known there was something. Nobody ends up that far from people without a reason. But she hadn't asked because she didn't have the right to ask, and because some part of her had recognized that he was carrying something that he wasn't ready to put down. She said it was the only time the world got quiet enough to hear itself think, he said. He was looking at the fire, not at Elena. His voice had the quality of something being said for the first time in a very long while, like a word in a language you'd almost forgotten. She was wrong. Storms aren't quiet, but I understood what she meant. Elena didn't say anything. She understood that this was not a conversation that needed responses. It was something else, a door opening a crack. Not an invitation to come inside, but evidence that there was something inside worth seeing. "I'm sorry," she said, after enough silence that it wouldn't feel like a quick reflex. "It was 3 years ago." He said it the way people say things when they're trying to make them smaller. It didn't work, but she understood the attempt. The fire settled again. Clara murmured in her sleep. "The storm's changing," Elena said after a while. Garrick listened. "Yes," he said, "it is." They sat there until the wind dropped to something manageable, and then Elena went back to the platform and lay down next to her daughters. And in the morning the sky was the particular hard blue that follows a heavy storm, and Garrick took Thomas out to assess the woodpile while Elena showed Ruth how to check the goat's water before it froze over. And the day began again the way all the days did, with work, with cold, with the mountain demanding everything they had, and all of them, slowly, learning how to give it. The distrust hadn't disappeared. Elena still watched him. She still made note of things. But it had changed texture, less like a wall and more like a habit she kept forgetting to maintain, and every time she remembered to go back to it, it seemed slightly less necessary than it had the time before. Outside, the woodpile was lower than it should have been. The stores were thinner than comfortable. The next storm was already building on the western peaks, visible on clear days as a dark smudge against the blue, patient, and enormous. And they were still alive, all 9 of them, which under the circumstances was not nothing. It was in fact most of what they had. The numbers Garrick showed her were worse than she'd imagined. He laid it out the morning after the storm broke, the way he'd promised. No softening, no rearrangement of facts to make them easier to receive. He set 3 clay jars on the table and explained what each one represented: dried beans, cornmeal, smoked meat. Then he set a 4th jar, empty, beside them. That one was for what they'd already used. It was nearly as large as the others combined. "We have maybe 3 weeks of food at current portions," he said. "Possibly 4 if we cut again. The pass won't open for 6 weeks minimum, probably 8. Elena looked at the jars. Ruth, who had come in from tending the goats and heard the last part, stood very still near the door. "Go check on the little ones," Elena told her quietly. Ruth went without arguing, which meant she understood enough to be scared. "The goats," Elena said. "They're giving less milk. Cold does that." Garrick moved the jars back to the shelf with the careful economy of someone handling things that matter. "I can stretch what we have. I'm good at stretching. But there's a point past which stretching becomes slow starvation, and it's better to know that now than to find out in 5 weeks when it's too late to do anything about it. So what do we do?" It wasn't really a question. She knew what men did on mountains when the food ran out. They hunted. "There's an elk herd that winters in the high bowl above the North Ridge," he said. "I've hunted there before. It's a 2-day trip in good conditions. In current conditions," he paused, "it's harder." "How much harder?" "The trail above the tree line has avalanche exposure. The temperature up there runs 20 degrees colder than here, and the herd may have moved deeper into the bowl, which would mean—" He stopped. "Which would mean more time, more exposure." "Yes." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this for a while. Since the second storm. And you didn't say anything. I was hoping the weather would break different." He said it without apology. It didn't. Elena sat with this for a moment. Outside, she could hear Daniel explaining something to James with great conviction and no apparent accuracy, and the twins' voices in the background, and Nora making the sound she made when she was working herself up toward a tantrum. The ordinary noise of her children, going about the ordinary business of being alive, not knowing that the margin between that ordinary business and something much worse had just been measured out in clay jars on a rough table. "When would you go?" she said. "Tomorrow morning, if the weather holds. Every day we wait is another day of stores." She looked at the window. The sky was hard and clear, the specific blue of high-altitude winter that looked beautiful from inside a warm cabin and would kill you if you respected it insufficiently. What are the avalanche risks on that trail? Real, he said it plainly. I won't tell you they're not. And if you don't come back, she said it the way she'd learned to say difficult things, directly, without cushioning, because cushioning just made you have to say it twice. Garrick looked at her without flinching. The goats will give some milk through the worst of it. I'll leave instructions for everything I know about rationing what's on those shelves. He paused. Thomas can manage more than he knows. You probably already knew that. Elena held his gaze. That's not nothing, she said, but it's not enough. No, it's not. The fire popped. Clara pulled herself upright using Elena's knee and looked at Garrick with the serene, uncomplicated attention of a 15-month-old who had not yet learned to be afraid of complicated conversations. Then don't die, Elena said. Garrick looked at Clara, then back at Elena. I'll do my best. He left before sunrise. Elena heard him moving through the dark, the quiet, purposeful sounds of a man who'd done this before, checking equipment with his hands in the firelight because he knew where everything was without looking. She lay still and didn't pretend to be asleep and didn't try to talk to him. There was nothing left to say. They'd said the functional things the night before, the rationing schedule, the spring location, which shelf held what, how to bank the fire to conserve wood over a long period. She'd listened and repeated everything back, and he'd confirmed it with a nod, and that had been their goodbye, which was appropriate because it was honest. He paused at the door. She thought he might say something. He didn't. He just went. She lay there in the dark and listened to the sound of him going, his footsteps in the snow growing quieter, and then gone. And then there was just the fire and 8 sleeping people and the mountain outside doing what mountains do, which is nothing and everything all at once. The first day without him was strange in a way she hadn't anticipated. The cabin felt larger, which made no physical sense. He was one person in a 9-person space and should have made a negligible difference to the room's dimensions. But his presence had been structural in some way she hadn't registered until it was absent. She caught herself twice turning to say something to him before remembering, which annoyed her. She ran the rationing as he'd instructed and kept the children busy because busy children are less hungry children, or at least they're hungry in a way that's easier to manage. She had Thomas reinforce the chinking on the north wall where the wind was finding gaps, which kept him occupied for most of the afternoon and gave him something to feel useful about. She set the twins and Daniel to mending what could be mended. Socks, mostly. Everything was socks. And she kept Nora close to the fire with a collection of small, smooth stones that Garrick had kept in a bowl for no purpose she'd identified. But that turned out to be excellent for a 2-year-old who needed something to sort and count and sort again. At bedtime, James asked where Garrick was. He went hunting, Elena said. When is he coming back? Soon. James considered this. He was 4, and 4-year-olds had a surprisingly sophisticated radar for the gap between what adults said and what they meant. Is he lost? No. He knows the mountain very well. Okay, James said, and lay down, and appeared to actually accept this, which was either a tribute to her delivery or to the particular confidence children place in mothers who have not yet given them reason not to. Ruth, who was 9 and did not have the same confidence, waited until the others were asleep and then came and sat beside Elena at the fire. He might not make it back, Ruth said. She didn't say it dramatically. Ruth didn't do dramatic. She said it the way she checked on the goats, practically, as a fact to be assessed. He might not, Elena agreed. Ruth was quiet for a moment, working with that. What do we do if he doesn't? Mom, the same things we're already doing. We're not helpless. We're going to run out of food. We're going to work on that problem every day until it's solved, or until the pass opens, or until something changes. Elena put her arm around her daughter. We didn't come this far by solving every problem perfectly. We came this far by not stopping. Ruth leaned against her, which was the most physically affectionate she usually allowed herself, being 9 and serious. I don't want anything to happen to him. Elena looked at the fire. Neither do I, she said, and meant it in a way that surprised her slightly. On the mountain, things were already going wrong. The trail to the high bowl was exactly as bad as Garrick had said it would be, and then some. The avalanche exposure on the north face was worse than his last trip up. New fracture lines visible across the snowfield, the particular settled look of a slope that was thinking about moving. He gave it wide berth and added an hour to the travel time, which pushed him past the tree line into the open bowl later than he'd planned, in dimming light and wind that had picked up considerably from the valley's calm. He found signs of the herd, tracks, droppings, the churned-up snow where they'd been pawing for buried grass. But they were older signs, 2 days at least. The herd had moved. Deeper in, by the look of it, toward the upper end of the bowl where the rock formation broke the worst of the wind and offered what passed for shelter at 8,000 feet in the dead of winter. He made camp in the trees at the bowl's edge, which was the reasonable thing to do. It was also deeply uncomfortable. The cold up here was different from the cabin's cold, not just colder in degree, but different in kind, the kind of cold that was patient and looking for mistakes. He built a fire that he kept small because fuel was limited and because light drew things, and he ate sparingly from what he'd carried, and he slept in intervals, waking every hour or so to feed the fire and listen. He found the herd the next morning, at the far end of the bowl, as he'd expected. 12 animals, gaunt with winter the same as everything else up here, picking through the snow for anything edible with the bleak persistence of creatures that had been built to endure. He worked downwind, slowly, over the course of 2 hours. This was the part of hunting that couldn't be rushed. The mountain didn't care about his timeline. The elk certainly didn't. He moved when the wind covered his movement, went still when it paused, read the terrain for the places where the snow had crusted enough to hold him without the crunch that would carry on the cold air. By the time he was in range, he was cold enough that his hands were not working as well as he needed them to. And he took 3 minutes he didn't want to spend just getting sensation back into his trigger finger, because one shot in these conditions was all he was going to get, and he could not afford to pull it early. He took a young bull on the herd's near edge. Clean kill, which he was grateful for. A wounded animal in this terrain, in these temperatures, could run for miles, and he could not afford to follow for miles. The herd scattered with the crack of the rifle and was gone into the upper bowl in 30 seconds. And then there was just the wind and the body of an elk and the sound of his own breathing. The work of field dressing an elk in sub-zero temperatures alone is not something that can be made to sound clean. It is cold and heavy and hard on the back and the hands, and it took him 2 hours. By the end of it, he had roughly 280 pounds of usable meat, more than he could carry in one trip, more than he'd probably be able to carry at all in current conditions. He packed what he could onto the frame he'd carried up, took the best cuts first, cached the rest high where the temperature would keep it, and something on 4 legs would need to work to reach it, and started back down. He'd been moving for 3 hours when he heard it. Not the elk. He knew what elk sounded like. He'd been hearing them his whole adult life. This was different, lower. The particular sound of something with too much weight in its chest trying to be quiet and not quite managing it. He stopped. The mountain lion was on a rock outcropping above the trail, about 30 feet ahead, the same pale gray-brown as the snow-dusted granite around it. It had probably been tracking the blood scent from the elk, and had found him instead, and was now engaged in the particular calculation that mountain lions perform when they encounter something large and uncertain, whether the risk was worth the meat. The rifle was on his back under the pack frame, impossible to reach in time. He had the knife at his belt and the one in his boot. He and the lion looked at each other across 30 feet of frozen mountain. Later, he would have difficulty reconstructing exactly how the next minutes went, which was normal. The brain didn't record violence the way it recorded other things. What he knew was that the cat came off the rock fast, and he got the belt knife out and got his arm up, and there was a period of extremely loud, extremely close chaos involving claws and the knife and the snow, and his own voice making sounds he didn't consciously choose to make. He came out of it on his back in the snow, with the cat not moving and his left arm opened from elbow to shoulder, and something in his side that he was fairly certain was a cracked rib, possibly 2. There was blood in the snow, a fair amount of it. He lay there for what was probably 30 seconds and felt his body taking inventory of everything it was unhappy about, which was extensive. Then he got up. He got up because there was nothing else to do. He was 3 hours from the cabin on a mountain trail in conditions that would kill him inside of an hour if he stopped moving. He had 200 pounds of meat on his back and a left arm that was seeping badly through his coat. He took the scarf from his neck and tied it around the arm as tight as he could manage one-handed, which was not as tight as he needed, and he picked up the pack frame and he started walking. He did not think about whether he could make it. Thinking about whether you could make it was what you did instead of making it. And he'd learned that a long time ago in a different kind of hard situation, the kind that had taken his wife and left him with nothing but the mountain and a reason to be good at not stopping. He thought about Elena's face when he told her the stores were low, the way she'd looked at the empty jar and not flinched and not cried and just said, "So what do we do?" He thought about James asking if he was lost, the way Ruth had sat beside her mother at the fire when she thought everyone else was asleep. He thought about Thomas putting wood on the fire before anyone asked him to. He walked. He walked until the tree line came back and the wind dropped and the trail widened slightly. Walked until the slope turned from north-facing to south-facing and the snow was less deep. Walked until the light was entirely gone and he was navigating by the particular darkness of the trail against the slightly lighter darkness of the snow on either side of it, which worked until it didn't, and he went sideways off the trail into a ditch that put him on his hands and knees with the pack frame driving down on his back and the cracked ribs introducing themselves very loudly. He stayed on his hands and knees for a while, not defeated, just stopped, briefly, while the pain had its say, and he waited for it to finish. He thought about the cabin's firelight, the way it showed through the single small window, amber and steady. He got up. He came in sight of the clearing 20 minutes later. The window was lit. Of course it was lit. Elena banked the fire carefully. She'd learned that quickly. She kept it steady and consistent the way she did everything she'd decided was important. He could see the light from 50 feet out, wavering and warm, and something in his chest that had been locked down tight for the better part of the day began to ease open just slightly at the sight of it. He made it to the door. He didn't quite make it through it. He got the door open and got one hand on the door frame, and then his legs made a decision without consulting him, and he went down in the doorway, the cold air from outside flooding in around him. And the last thing he was clearly aware of before the darkness thickened was the light from the fire and the sound of Elena saying his name. Not screaming it, not panicking, just saying it with the sharp clarity of someone who had already assessed the situation and was already moving. He thought with the last coherent part of his mind that she would handle it. Whatever came next, she would handle it. The cold pressed in around the edges of the open door, and the firelight held, and the darkness took the rest. She got the door shut first. That was the thing nobody would have thought to do in that moment. With a 200-pound man collapsed half in and half out of the cabin, bleeding through his coat onto the threshold, the instinct was to go to him immediately, and Elena did go to him. But she kicked the door shut behind her first because the cold coming through that open door would kill everyone in the room if she let it run long enough. And she was already thinking 2 steps ahead even while her hands were finding his collar and pulling. "Thomas." Her voice was even. She'd decided in the half-second between seeing him and reaching him that even was what the room needed. "Thomas, now." Thomas was already moving. He was 11 years old, and he'd been raised by a woman who solved problems instead of performing distress about them. And something in the last 2 months on this mountain had finished a process that had been underway since August. The process of turning a boy into something older than 11. He got to Garrick's other side without being told twice, and together they dragged him fully inside, and Elena got the door properly latched and turned back to assess what they were dealing with. It was bad. She'd known it was bad from the doorway, but the firelight showed her the details now, and bad didn't quite cover it. His left coat sleeve was soaked dark from mid-forearm to shoulder. The scarf he'd tied around it was saturated and had stopped doing anything useful some time ago. There were 3 distinct gash marks across the right side of his face that she hadn't been able to see in the dark but were visible now. Not deep enough to be immediately life-threatening, but ragged and dirty. And out here, dirty wounds had a way of becoming the thing that killed you after the immediate danger had passed. And when she got his coat open, she found the other damage. His right side, 2 ribs at least that shifted wrong when she pressed along them, and the particular tight way he was holding himself, even unconscious, that meant every breath was an argument. "Is he dying?" Sophie asked from behind her. Elena turned. All 7 children were awake and arranged in a rough semicircle at the edge of the firelight, The little ones in front because that's how children organize themselves, with Nora and James in the very front looking at Garrick with the wide, unfiltered attention of kids who hadn't yet learned to look away from difficult things. "He's hurt," Elena said. "I need everyone to do exactly what I say, exactly when I say it. Can you do that?" A chorus of yes that was more unified than children usually managed, which told her they were scared. "Ruth, the water. Full pot, on the fire, right now. Thomas, I need the knife boiled. The small one on the third shelf. Put it in the pot when the water heats. Daniel, more wood. Keep the fire up. Don't let it drop. Twins, I need every clean cloth in this cabin. Everything. Check under the platform, check the mending pile. Everything." She was already moving back to Garrick as she said it, unwinding the destroyed scarf from his arm, assessing. "James, Nora, sit on the platform and do not move from it. Can you do that for me?" James took Nora's hand. "Yes," he said, with the gravity of a small person accepting a real responsibility. The cabin became organized chaos, which was better than unorganized chaos, which was better than the paralyzed kind. Elena worked on the arm while the water heated, cleaning the wound with what she had, which wasn't much, a small bottle of whiskey that Garrick kept on the high shelf for reasons she'd never asked about and was now deeply grateful for. The gash was long, but not as deep as the blood volume had suggested. The cold had done some of the work of slowing the bleeding, which was one of the few useful things the cold had contributed tonight. He came to while she was stitching it. She was using a curved needle she'd found in the mending supplies and cheese thread that she'd boiled with the knife, and she'd done 3 stitches before his eyes opened and he looked at the ceiling of his own cabin with the confused, unfocused expression of a man who wasn't sure yet where he was. "Don't move," she said. He turned his head and found her face, something behind his eyes, resolved. "You're stitching my arm," he said. His voice was rough and thick. "I am. Don't move." He looked at the needle. "Did you boil that?" "Yes." "And the thread?" "Garrick." She pulled the next stitch through and watched him absorb it, jaw tight, not making a sound. "I'm going to need you to stop supervising me and let me work." He was quiet for a moment. "Fair enough," he said. She did 11 stitches. They were not pretty stitches. She was a mother and a seamstress, not a surgeon, and her hands were not entirely steady, though she made them close enough. But they were tight and even, and when she was done, the arm had stopped bleeding in any serious way. She wrapped it clean and moved to his face, which required less stitching but more careful cleaning, and he held still for all of it with the stoic endurance of a man who'd made a private decision that this was something he was going to survive. The ribs she couldn't do much about. She wrapped his torso tight with the best long cloth she had, which would at least hold them in place and make breathing less of an event, and she told him so. "I know," he said. "I've cracked ribs before." Somehow that doesn't surprise me. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face and then stopped, because smiling moved his face and his face had 3 claw marks on it. "The meat," he said. "The pack. I dropped it outside. Thomas already brought it in." She didn't look up from the wrapping. "All of it. He made 2 trips. A pause. "That's a lot of weight for—" "He's stronger than you think." She tied off the wrapping and sat back on her heels. "You killed an elk." "And a mountain lion, apparently." He said it without particular pride, just factual. "The cat found me on the way back." "I can see that." She looked at his face directly for the first time since she'd started working, not assessing wounds, but just looking at him, at the person behind the damage, the person who had gone up a mountain in conditions that should have turned him back and come home with 200 pounds of meat and 3 cracked ribs and a mauled arm, and had still, somehow, made it through the door. "You should sleep." "I'm all right." "You're not. You're coherent, which is better than you were 20 minutes ago, but you're not all right." She stood, her knees aching from crouching on the stone floor. "The children are going to want to see that you're alive. After that, you sleep." He didn't argue, which told her more about how he was actually feeling than anything he'd said. She brought the children over one at a time, which was her own version of crowd management. All seven at once would have been too much noise for a man with a head that was clearly pounding. James came first because he'd been the most quietly worried, and he stood beside Garrick and looked at the bandaged arm with the serious attention of a child doing an inspection, and then looked up at Garrick's face and said, "You got hurt." "A little," Garrick said. "Does it hurt?" "Some," James nodded, as though this confirmed something he'd suspected. Then he reached out and very carefully put his hand over Garrick's undamaged right hand, not holding it, just placing his small palm on top of it, the way children offer comfort when they don't have words for it yet. Garrick looked at the small hand on his, and something in his face shifted in a way that had nothing to do with pain. "Thank you," Garrick said. He said it to James directly, like one person to another. James nodded again and stepped back, satisfied. The fever arrived the next morning. Elena had been expecting it. Infections didn't ask your permission or consult your timeline, and wounds on a mountain man who'd been bleeding in the snow for hours were infections waiting to happen. By midday, Garrick's temperature was high enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him from a foot away, and by evening he was in the grip of something that had detached him from the cabin, from the mountain, from the present tense entirely. He talked in fever, not continuously, not dramatically, in fragments. The way people do when their mind is sorting through things, it normally keeps filed and locked. He said his wife's name twice. Margaret. He said something about a spring that Elena couldn't follow the sense of. Once he said, with sudden clarity and some distress, "The north wall," and Elena said, "Thomas already checked it, it's fine." And he settled back without waking, and she wasn't sure whether she was comforting him or having a conversation with the fever, and it didn't matter. It seemed to work either way. She slept in shifts. Thomas took the middle of the night watch without being asked. She woke at 3 a.m. to find him sitting beside Garrick with a damp cloth, replacing it when it warmed, doing it with the quiet concentration of someone who had decided this was his job and didn't need supervision for it. Elena stood in the dark and watched her son caring for a man who 3 months ago had been a stranger, and she thought about all the ways you could build a family that had nothing to do with blood or law or any kind of official arrangement. "Go back to sleep," she told Thomas. "I've got it. I'm not tired." "Thomas." He looked up at her. In the firelight he looked, for a moment, genuinely older than 11. Not adult, but something in between. The particular gravity of a child who has been trusted with real things and has risen to meet them. "He went up that mountain for us," Thomas said. It wasn't accusatory. It was just a fact he needed to say out loud. "I know. I want to do something." "You already are." She put her hand on his shoulder. "You've been doing things for 2 days. Now sleep. I'll call you if I need you." He went. She sat with Garrick through the rest of the night, keeping the cloth cool, keeping the fire exactly where she needed it, warm enough for the children, not so warm that the fever had more to work with than it needed. By the 3rd day of fever, she was genuinely afraid. Not the managed, behind-the-face afraid that she'd been carrying since the first day on the mountain. This was a different quality of fear, the kind that sat in your stomach and wouldn't be reasoned with. His arm was red at the edges of the stitches in a way she didn't like. His breathing was shallow because of the ribs and the fever together, and shallow breathing in a chest infection was how things went from serious to something worse. She did the only thing she could do, which was everything possible, and then more than that. She cleaned the arm twice a day and used the last of the whiskey on it. She got broth into him in the moments when the fever loosened enough for him to swallow, which was a process of considerable patience and occasional failure. She kept the wrapping on his ribs tight and changed it when it loosened. She talked to him when he was conscious enough to hear, not because she thought it was medically essential, but because she'd discovered, somewhere in the small hours of the second night, that it seemed to anchor him, that her voice was something he followed back toward the surface when the fever tried to pull him under. She told him things she probably wouldn't have said if he'd been fully conscious. About William, about the early years when things had been good before the drought, and the debt and the slow disaster that had ended with her and 7 children and a broken wagon in a dying town. About how she'd stopped trusting her own judgment somewhere in those years and had never quite figured out how to start again. She wasn't sure how much he heard. Some of it, probably. Enough. On the fourth night, he woke clearly, not fever shallow, but actually present, his eyes focused and his voice back to something close to its normal register. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Elena sitting beside him, and said, "How long?" 4 days. He absorbed this. The children. All fine. Eating well. Thomas has been running the wood and water. Ruth has the goats. She paused. Daniel tried to teach the goats a trick yesterday. I'll let him tell you how that went. Garrick looked at her. You didn't sleep. I slept. Not much. She looked back at him evenly. I seem to remember having this conversation from the other side. Something in his face gave way slightly, the way it occasionally did when she said something he hadn't anticipated. Not a smile, or not only that, something more than a smile, something that had to do with recognition, the particular relief of being known by someone. There's redness on the arm, she said, because she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't there. I'm watching it. It hasn't spread in the last day, which I think is good. Let me see. She unwound the wrapping and showed him. He examined it with the critical attention of a man assessing damage he understood better than she did, and when he was done, he said, You did good work on this. Don't sound surprised. I'm not surprised. He said it simply. I've been watching you handle things for 2 months. I stopped being surprised a while ago. Elena rewrapped the arm without answering, because the thing she wanted to say in response to that was something she wasn't ready to say yet. And she'd learned enough about herself in the last weeks to know when to give a feeling time before she gave it words. Over the next several days, as the fever retreated and Garrick began the slow work of mending, something shifted in the cabin's atmosphere that was harder to name than the practical changes, though there were practical changes too. He couldn't work, which meant Elena ran the cabin, which meant the children saw her running it, which changed something in how they understood the arrangement they'd all landed in. They'd always known she was capable, but there's a difference between knowing your mother is capable in the abstract and watching her stitch a man's arm in the dark and keep a fire and manage a wood supply and negotiate the particular diplomacy of 7 children in a small space, all at the same time, without losing herself. Ruth said, On the 5th day, I think you could run this place yourself. Elena looked up from the fire. Probably. But it's better with him. It wasn't a question. It was Ruth being Ruth, cutting straight to the conclusion through the middle of everything else. Elena considered giving a careful answer and decided her daughter had earned better than careful. Yes, she said. It's better with him. Garrick started sitting up on the 6th day. Vertical for the first time since the mountain, he looked diminished in a way that was disorienting. He was still enormous, still took up more room than most people, but there was something about seeing him propped against the wall with his arm in a sling and 2 cracked ribs that made him look, for the first time, like someone who could be hurt. The children treated this with varying degrees of tact. James brought him things, small objects, a smooth stone, a pine cone, the random tributes of a 4-year-old who'd decided to be helpful. The twins asked him direct questions about the mountain lion that he answered with patient economy. Thomas didn't say much. He just sat near him in the evenings, working on whatever needed mending, in the companionable quiet that they'd built between them over the winter, and occasionally asked a practical question about the cached meat on the mountain, about the spring thaw timeline, about how to read the ice on the creek. And Garrick answered each one as though it were a reasonable question from a reasonable person, which it was. On the 8th day of recovery, Elena came in from banking the animal shelter against an incoming cold snap to find Garrick at the table with a cup of something hot, looking out the small window at the mountain with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the usual watchful blankness he kept on his face in public, but something quieter than that, something at rest. She sat across from him and he poured her a cup of the same something, pine needle tea, which she had developed ambivalent feelings about over the winter, but which was warm and had the virtue of existing. Margaret, she said. It was the first time she'd said the name to him directly. He looked at her, not startled, not closed off. He'd known, probably, that she'd heard him in the fever. She died in the winter, he said. 3rd year we were up here. Fever took her in 8 days. A pause. He turned the cup in his large hands. I thought it was the mountain, that the mountain had taken her from me. So I stayed I don't know, to be where she'd been. To punish it, maybe. That's not rational. Grief isn't rational. No. He looked at the window. She would have liked your children. We wanted children. It just didn't happen. He said it plainly, without the particular flinching that people sometimes did around things that had hurt them badly. She would have had something to say about Sophie and May trying to outwit each other every waking hour. Elena almost laughed. Almost. She would have had her hands full. She liked full hands. He looked back at Elena. I should have come down off the mountain years ago. I know that. I didn't have a reason that was strong enough. The fire cracked. Outside, the first flakes of the new storm were beginning to dust the window. You had 7 reasons, Elena said. They just hadn't shown up yet. He looked at her for a long moment, that direct, undecorated gaze that she'd learned to read better now, that she understood was not blankness but attention, the deep kind, the kind that most people only gave to things they were deciding were important. 8, he said, quietly, not looking away. Elena held his gaze and let the word settle where it landed, which was squarely in the middle of something she'd been carefully not naming for a while now. She didn't deflect it or qualify it or turn it into something safer. Get some rest, she said instead. You're still pale. I'm always pale. It's winter. You're paler than winter. She stood taking her cup. And you're not running calculations on the stores tonight. I've already done it. We're going to be all right. He watched her move back toward the fire where her children were, where their children were moving through the evening in the easy, unselfconscious way of kids who felt safe. Daniel telling James something elaborate, the twins negotiating with each other in their private language, Ruth reading to Nora from the one book the cabin owned. Elena, he said. She turned. Thank you. He said it the same way he'd said everything real to her, plainly, without decoration, meaning exactly what he said, and nothing less. She looked at him. We're not done yet, she said, but she said it like a promise, not a warning. And outside, the snow came down on the mountain that had tested all of them and found them still standing, and the fire held the dark at bay, and the cabin that had been built for one held 9 people who were, in ways none of them had planned for and all of them had needed, becoming something that none of them had a clean word for yet, but that felt, against every odd, through every hard day, unmistakably like home. The pass opened on a Tuesday in late March, which Elena knew not because she'd been counting days with any precision, but because Garrick came in from his morning check of the upper trail and said, "It's passable," with the same tone he used to report on the woodpile or the state of the creek, factual, unadorned, giving her the information and leaving what to do with it entirely up to her. She was at the fire making the morning oats. Clara was on her hip, as usual, navigating the world from that particular altitude and finding it satisfactory. The older children were in various states of waking up, Thomas already pulling on his boots, the twins still horizontal and conducting a whispered argument about something that had apparently started in their sleep. How long will it stay open? Elena said. Weather's holding. A week, maybe more if we're lucky. He poured himself coffee. Real coffee, the last of what he'd bought in Red Hollow back in October, rationed across the winter to 1 cup every few days, and the fact that he'd shared it without comment said something she hadn't forgotten. We should move soon if we're going. We should move soon if we're going. She noted the construction of it. Not you should move, not I'll take you down, but we. And the conditional at the end, if we're going. She didn't think he'd done it deliberately. Garrick Hale was not a man who carefully engineered his sentences for effect, which meant the we had come out naturally, which meant something. I know, she said. She fed the children breakfast and then told Thomas to take the others outside for an hour, that she needed to think. Thomas, who had developed over the winter an almost uncanny ability to read a room, simply nodded and collected his siblings with a minimum of protest, though getting the twins moving before they were ready always involved a certain amount of negotiation. When the cabin was quiet, Elena sat at the table with her coffee cooling in front of her and thought about Red Hollow. She thought about Alderman Pruitt's feed store, and the 41 people who'd looked at her children and seen a problem to be distributed. She thought about the tack room behind the livery stable, the smell of it, the cold that had come through the walls in a way this cabin's walls didn't, because this cabin had been built by someone who understood cold and took it seriously. She thought about $11.40 in a tobacco tin and a wagon with 3 wheels, and the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who had already decided what you were worth. Then she thought about the last 4 months. She thought about James putting his small hand over Garrick's without being asked, about Ruth telling her matter-of-factly that things were better with him, about Thomas getting up before dawn to feed the fire, doing it not because someone told him to, but because he decided it was his responsibility, which was a different thing entirely, and a better one. About Sophie and May, who had arrived at this mountain as 2 frightened 5-year-olds clinging to each other, and who were now something more complicated and more competent, children who knew how to read weather and check ice thickness, and quiet a restless goat. About Daniel, who had stopped breaking things once he'd been given real things to do. About Nora, who had learned to walk steadily in snow boots 3 sizes too big. About Clara, who was saying her first real words now, and whose first consistent word after Mama had been, with a frequency that Elena found both touching and slightly complicated, Gar. Garrett came back inside, stomped the snow from his boots, and went to the shelves to check something. He moved through the cabin the way he always did, with the economy of a man who'd learned not to waste motion, and Elena watched him and thought about what it would mean to leave. Not just what would be lost, practically, the shelter, the food security, the particular knowledge of this mountain that he carried in his body, but what would be lost in the way that didn't have a practical name. "Garrick," she said. He turned. "Sit down." He sat across from her with the directness of a man who didn't see the point of hesitating when someone wanted to talk. He looked at her and waited, and she appreciated that about him. He never filled silences that weren't his to fill. "If we go back to Red Hollow," she said, "what is there?" He considered the question seriously, which she'd expected. "The town, whatever work you can find there." He paused. "Pruitt." "Yes, Pruitt." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "And if we don't go back to Red Hollow?" He was very still for a moment in the way he got when something mattered enough to be careful with. "Then you stay." "Then we stay," she said. "If you'll have us." The fire shifted behind her. Outside she could hear the children. Daniel's voice raised in some kind of declaration. One of the twins telling him he was wrong, James's high laugh at something. The ordinary sounds of her family being alive on a mountain that had done its considerable best to kill them and had not managed it. Garrick looked at her across the table. His face did the thing it did when he was feeling something he didn't have easy words for. Not closing down, but going careful. The way you go careful around something you don't want to break. "Elena," he said, "I'm not easy to live with. I noticed. I'm set in my ways and I don't talk enough and I have opinions about how things should be done that I don't always explain before I act on them. Also noticed. And you have 7 children. I'm aware. I'm saying," he stopped, tried again, "I want you to stay. I want you to stay so much that I need you to go in with your eyes open, because I'm not going to be able to ask you again if you leave and then change your mind. I don't have that in me." Elena looked at him steadily. This was the most he'd said about his own interior in 4 months, and she understood what it cost him to say it, which made her take it more seriously than a longer speech would have. "My eyes have been open since October," she said. "I've had all winter to change my mind. I didn't." Something in him settled, visibly, the way a structure settles when the last piece is placed and it recognizes itself as complete. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. It wasn't romantic exactly. There were no dramatic declarations, no cinematic moment of 2 people recognizing their destiny in each other's eyes. There was a man and a woman at a rough table in a small cabin at the end of winter, both of them damaged in different ways and clear-eyed about it, deciding together to try something that had every practical reason to be difficult, and one reason that outweighed all the practical ones. It was already real, already built, already proven by 4 months of hard living, and walking away from it would have been the stranger choice. She told the children that afternoon. She called them all inside and sat them down and explained plainly that they were going to stay on the mountain, that this was going to be their home now, not temporarily, but properly, that there were changes that would come with that, things to be worked out over time, but that was the shape of things going forward. The twins exchanged a look of the kind only people who've shared a womb can manage, a whole conversation conducted in a glance. And then Sophie said, "Can I have the goat?" "You can help take care of the goat," Elena said. "Nobody owns the goat." "I think she likes me better." "The goat likes whoever's holding the feed," Garrick said from the corner, and Sophie considered this information and appeared to accept it as a reasonable framework. Daniel asked if he could build things. Garrick told him that there was going to be a lot of building and that if he wanted to be useful for it, he'd need to learn to do it right. And Daniel looked like he'd been given something valuable, which he had. James simply climbed onto the platform and settled himself with the contentment of a child who had already decided this place was home weeks ago and was satisfied that the adults had finally arrived at the same conclusion. Ruth waited until the others had dispersed and then came and stood beside Elena with her arms folded, a posture she'd inherited directly from her mother. "You're sure?" Ruth said. "I'm sure." Ruth looked at Garrick. He looked back at her with the same level of attention he gave everything. Ruth was 9 years old and the most serious person in the room by some margin, and the look she gave him was the look of someone conducting a final assessment on which a decision depended. Whatever she saw, it satisfied her. "Okay," she said, and went to help with the goats. Garrick watched her go, and then looked at Elena with an expression that was somewhere between impressed and wary. "She's going to be formidable," he said. "She already is." The work of building a real life in that place was not small or fast or clean, and it would be dishonest to say otherwise. Deciding to stay was the simplest part. Everything after that was the actual work. The cabin needed to be bigger. That was the most immediate reality, and they addressed it when the ground thawed enough to work. Garrick and Thomas planning it, then doing it, with Daniel as an increasingly useful third set of hands as the weeks went on. The addition went on the east side, doubling the sleeping space, which allowed the cabin proper to function as the living and cooking space without everyone sleeping where they also ate. The work took 6 weeks and was physically hard and occasionally contentious. Garrick had strong opinions about timber selection, and Thomas had developing opinions about everything, and they argued with the good-natured stubbornness of two people who respected each other enough to disagree. Elena watched this and felt something complicated and good. Thomas had not had a man to argue with in a serious way since August. She hadn't realized how much he'd needed it until she watched him hold his ground over a timber joint and Garrick push back and Thomas adjust his position based on the logic rather than the authority, and Garrick nod once in the way that meant he was satisfied. And Thomas turned back to work, trying not to look like this had mattered as much as it had. It mattered enormously. She knew that. There was a morning in late April when Garrick came in from checking the upper trail. A habit he maintained regardless of season, a daily reading of the mountain's intentions. And he stood at the door with mud on his boots and said, "There's a family at the lower crossing, wagons stuck." Elena looked at him. "Are they in trouble?" Axles cracked. "They're not going anywhere today." She was already reaching for her coat. "Is there room?" "I'll sleep in the lean-to," he said, which was not an answer to the question she'd asked, and was also a complete answer to the question she'd asked. The family was named Carr, a husband and wife, and 3 young children, heading west on optimism, and a wagon that had been older than it looked. They were cold and tired, and the wife, whose name was Harriet, had the hollow, pressed-down look of a woman who'd been holding herself together through too many consecutive bad days and was almost out of resources for it. Elena recognized that look intimately. They stayed 5 days while Garrick and the husband repaired the axle, and the weather held. Harriet Carr sat by Elena's fire and ate good food, and slept in a warm space and let her children run with Elena's children, and by day 3 looked like a different person, or maybe like the person she'd been before the road had worn her down to essentials. On the last morning, when the wagon was packed and the family was almost ready to go, Harriet took Elena's hands and said, "How did you end up here? On a mountain in the middle of nowhere with all these children and a cabin this solid?" Elena thought about how to answer that. She thought about Red Hollow and Pruitt and a man stepping out of shadows to make an offer that made no practical sense. She thought about cold and hunger and fear, and a family being built out of the raw material of hardship, the way things sometimes get built that way. Not by plan, but by pressure. Not by design, but by necessity and choice. "We stayed through a winter," she said finally, "and then it turned out we didn't want to leave." Harriet looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Garrick, who was checking the wagon wheel one final time with Thomas at his shoulder, following the logic of it, and at the children running in the mud of a mountain April, and back at Elena. "You're lucky," Harriet said. Elena thought about what luck meant, whether any of this had been luck, or whether luck was just what you called it when you couldn't explain the combination of desperation and stubbornness and one strange man's unexpected offer that had brought you to a specific clearing on a specific mountain at a specific moment in your life. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe we just didn't give up at the right times." Word traveled the way it always did in mountain country, slowly, through a chain of travelers and traders and people passing the crossing at the bottom of the South Trail. The family on Garrick Hale's mountain, the widow with the 7 children who'd survived the worst winter in recent memory in a one-room cabin up in the high country. By summer, there was a loose kind of reputation accumulating around them. Not legend, nothing grand, just the particular attention that gets paid in hard country to people who have demonstrated they can manage hard country. A trader named Pollard started making the cabin a regular stop on his routes, coming up twice a year with supplies that Elena traded for preserved food and the elk hides that Garrick prepared through the summer. Through Pollard, they got news of the wider world, which they received with the detached interest of people who had developed, through necessity, a mostly self-sufficient life. The news of Red Hollow was that Pruitt had lost the feed store to debt. Elena received this information without particular satisfaction and without particular sorrow. The children grew. This sounds simple and is not simple at all. Growing is the hardest and most constant thing children do, and watching it requires a particular quality of attention that is also a form of letting go. Thomas turned 12 and then 13 and developed the voice change with what Elena could only describe as aggressive promptness, going from a boy's voice to something much lower over what seemed like 2 weeks. He became indispensable on the mountain in a way that was not forced or performed. He simply found the things that needed doing and did them, with Garrick's economy of motion slowly entering his own habits, the way you absorb the style of someone you spend enough time watching. Ruth remained relentlessly practical and grew into it rather than out of it, which was the best possible outcome. By the time she was 11, she'd taken over management of the goats entirely and started keeping records. Meticulous, systematic records of milk yield and feed consumption and a dozen other variables. In a ledger she'd made herself from scraps of paper Pollard brought up. Garrick looked at these records once and said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "You should be keeping track of the weather too. Date, temperature, wind direction. Over enough years it tells you things." Ruth had started the weather records the next morning. Sophie got the goat, effectively, if not officially. The animal followed her around the clearing with the devoted attention of a creature that had made a personal decision and was not reconsidering it. Daniel learned to build things correctly, which took longer than he wanted, and produced 2 structures that had to be dismantled and several that held. The ones that held, he was proud of with the specific pride of someone who understood what the failures had cost them. James turned 5 that summer on the mountain and had a party that consisted of a cake Elena made from the limited ingredients available, dense and imperfect, and apparently delicious, judging by the rate at which it disappeared, and Garrick making him a small carved figure of an elk that James received with the reverence of someone who understood it was a serious gift. Nora and Clara grew up as mountain children in a way their older siblings hadn't quite been shaped by. They didn't know another life, and it showed in how they moved through the world, with a physical confidence and a comfort with difficult terrain that the older ones had had to acquire through experience. There was a moment, late in that first full summer, that Elena returned to for the rest of her life when she wanted to understand how it had all happened. She'd come back from the spring after the evening water run, one of the tasks she'd taken from Thomas to give him time for other work, and she'd stopped at the edge of the clearing because the scene in front of her had the quality of something she wanted to hold still long enough to actually see. Garrick was sitting on the new section of the cabin's foundation, which wasn't finished yet, and Clara had climbed up beside him and was chattering in the enthusiastic, partially coherent way of a 2-year-old who had a great deal to say and not quite enough language for all of it yet. And Garrick was listening with his full attention, responding to each statement with the same seriousness he brought to everything. And Clara was clearly delighted by this, by being taken seriously, by a large man treating her stream of consciousness narration as though it contained important information. Which, Elena thought, watching from the tree line, it probably did. 2-year-olds were not wrong about as many things as adults assumed. She stood there for a minute with the water bucket in her hand and the evening light coming sideways through the pines, and felt something that was not quite happiness, because happiness was too simple a word for it. It was more like recognition. The recognition that the specific arrangement of people in this specific place was not a temporary condition or a compromise or a stopgap solution to a crisis. It was an actual life. Hers. Built from the wreckage of a different one, constructed from hard winters and inadequate food and arguments over timber joints and 100 small daily negotiations between people who were different in almost every way except in the ways that turned out to matter. She thought about William because she still thought about William. She thought about the man he'd been, the life they'd had, the way grief doesn't ever entirely leave but changes form over time into something less sharp and more like weather. Present sometimes, not present other times, part of the general condition of being a person who has loved and been changed by that love. She didn't think she owed it to him to be unhappy. She didn't think he would have wanted that, or that it would have done him any honor. She walked back into the clearing and set the water down, and Clara saw her and yelled, "Mama!" with the enthusiasm of a child who greets her mother like a returning expedition even when she's only been gone 20 minutes. And Elena picked her up, and Clara immediately pointed back at Garrick, as though Elena might have missed him, and said, "Gar, building." "I see him," Elena said. Garrick looked up at her. He had sawdust in his beard and a cut on his knuckle from earlier that he'd already forgotten about, and the scar across his nose that she knew now had come from a fall on the mountain the 3rd winter he was up here, not from a fight, as some people in Red Hollow had apparently assumed. He looked at her with the direct, undecorated attention she'd learned to receive without flinching, and he said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. She sat down beside him on the unfinished foundation, and Clara distributed herself across both their laps in the boneless way of very small children, and they sat in the quiet of a mountain evening while the light went golden and then amber, and the children's voices came from somewhere behind the cabin, and the trees held the last warmth of the day for as long as they could before letting it go. There were 2 travelers who came through the crossing in September, a couple heading east rather than west. Unusual enough that Pollard mentioned it when he came up the following week. He said they'd stopped at the bottom of the trail and asked about the cabin up on the mountain, whether the stories were true, whether a widow really had brought 7 children through that winter in a 1-room cabin above the tree line. Pollard said he'd told them, yes, more or less, that's what had happened, and one of them had shaken their head and said they couldn't imagine it. Couldn't imagine how a person managed something like that. Elena listened to this and thought about how to explain what she would have said to those travelers if she'd been there to say it. She would have said, "You manage it the way you manage everything that seems impossible before you're in the middle of it, which is 1 day at a time, and sometimes 1 hour, and sometimes 1 decision, made as well as you can with the information you have and the resources available to you, and then the next decision, and the next. There is no secret. There is no special strength that some people have and others don't. There is just the choice, made repeatedly, to keep going. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, there are people along the way who make the keeping going less lonely. And if you're lucky, or stubborn, or some combination of the two, you find a place where the keeping going becomes something else, becomes staying." She didn't say this to Pollard. She just nodded and asked what else he'd brought, and whether the sugar was the good kind this time, or the kind that had clearly been repacked from something inferior. But she thought it, and it felt true in the way that only things feel true when they've been lived rather than arrived at, when the understanding comes from the inside of an experience rather than the outside of it. The 2nd winter was hard. Not as hard as the 1st. They were more prepared. The stores were properly calculated. The addition to the cabin meant actual sleeping space. and 8 months of living on the mountain had given all of them knowledge they hadn't had when they arrived. But it was still a mountain winter, and mountain winters did not make allowances for familiarity. The difference was that they moved through it together without the friction of strangers learning each other. Garrick's rules were no longer rules. They'd become habits, absorbed into the daily rhythm of the household, the way his particular way of starting a fire, and Thomas's habit of checking the wood before anyone asked, and Elena's system for the food stores had all become part of a single, larger pattern. The cabin worked. Not perfectly. Nothing worked perfectly, and she'd stopped expecting it to. But it worked in the messy, functional, occasionally contentious way that a real household works when the people in it have decided they're in it together. There was a night in February of that second winter when a storm came through fast and hit harder than the signs had suggested, and the temperature dropped 30 degrees inside of an hour, and they lost one of the goats to it despite everything they tried, and James cried in the way that children cry when they lose animals. Not just about the goat, but about everything that had been lost before that they hadn't quite had the vocabulary for. And Garrick sat with him on the platform and didn't try to explain or improve or rationalize any of it. He just sat there, a large, scarred mountain man with a boy who was sad and held still for the grief the way you hold still for weather. Elena watched from the fire and thought, this is what it looks like. Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic sacrifice, though that had happened too, up in the high bowl, and it had mattered. But this, the ordinary willingness to sit with someone in their sadness without trying to fix it. This was what she'd been trying to name since October. Spring came again, the way spring came on the mountain. Not gently, not all at once, but in the halting 2 steps forward, 1 step back way of high-altitude seasons, with warm days followed by hard frosts, followed by something that almost felt like real warmth before the mountain changed its mind again. And then one morning, the snow off the south-facing rocks, and there were mud, and the first cautious greenery at the edge of the tree line, and the mountain felt for the first time in months like somewhere a person might choose to live rather than somewhere a person survived. That spring they put in a proper kitchen garden, something Elena had been planning since December. Garrick had skepticism about what would actually grow at this altitude and was partially right. A fair number of things didn't, but enough did that by summer they had vegetables that hadn't come out of a clay pot, and Elena made a soup from actual fresh ingredients that she served to 9 people around a table that was now big enough to hold them all. And the soup was good enough that even Thomas, who had developed opinions about food, said so without being asked. It was, by most measures, not a remarkable meal. It was soup. They'd had a great deal of soup over the past year and a half, but they were all there, all 9 of them, at a table that hadn't existed when the winter started, in a cabin that was twice the size it had been, on a mountain that had tried to kill them and failed, and the soup was made from things they'd grown and ground, they'd broken themselves, and outside the window the mountain was green at the edges and the sky was the hard, clean blue of high altitude in summer. Garrick looked at the table of people who had arrived on his mountain as strangers and had become, through the alchemical pressure of necessity and shared difficulty and daily choice, something he hadn't known how to want anymore. He looked at Elena across the table and she looked back, and Clara, between them, said something entirely incomprehensible that made Sophie laugh. And Daniel argued a point with Thomas that Thomas deflected without rising to it. And the twins debated something that required hand gestures, and Ruth wrote something in the margin of her weather ledger with a small, satisfied nod. Nobody declared anything. Nobody made a speech. They just ate the soup. That is how it actually goes when you find the place you're meant to be. Not in a grand moment of recognition, but in 100 small ones, accumulating quietly over months and seasons, until one day you're sitting at a table you built yourself, eating food you grew yourself, surrounded by people you chose and who chose you back, and you realize that what you thought you were surviving turned out to be something else entirely. It turned out to be your life, the real one, the one that was worth all the rest of it. The mountain kept its winter and its silences and its testing. It would always do that. It wasn't capable of otherwise. But inside the walls of a cabin that had grown room by room the way a family grows, around a fire that someone always got up before dawn to tend, on a piece of earth that had been survived and then settled, and then slowly, imperfectly, irrevocably loved. Inside all of that, something held, something that had been built not from ease, but from endurance, not from luck, but from the daily decision, made again and again by imperfect people who had every reason to stop, to keep going anyway. That was enough. That had always been enough. It just took a hard mountain winter to prove it.